In this last block, we are dealing with advanced questions. Of artificial consciousness. It also serves as a summary and transition towards the lab task or the seminar task, to be more precisely. The dealing is very brief because most of the topics that I will sketch here or briefly mention are actually seminar tasks by themselves, and you should develop your own views. Let's go through them in an unsorted fashion. It should actually also open up the space and be a bit of an inspiration for you on where to go and what to think and what to do. Okay, first of all, let's paint a picture of what artificial consciousness could actually look like. In my opinion, as I stated in the Media and Brain lecture, it is, I think, that in the cortex we have centers that communicate with each other, that are densely connected, maybe not fully connected, but that might also form ring structures and shift information here and there. So that is certainly the case in the so-called subcortical regions. One block in there is the inner screen, or the inner monitor, as it is sometimes referred to, and it appears that individual centers, like for language processing and for others, tend to give back their information, maybe as a form of recurrent reprocessing, recycling of ideas, of thoughts, in order to cause fresh stimulation. This inner screen is intriguing in a number of ways. Two of them are because it is linked to the discussion of free will. And the second one, it is very much the focus of the so-called heart problem, which is functing versus feeling. And before we go through these 2 points, I would also like to point out that a model of consciousness that looks like this is in itself also a memory structure, because it means that by going back and forth, information is not just refined between the centers and re-evaluated, but it is also simply kept in the brain, thus creating a constant personality and creating constant stimuli that go outside into different area, priming us, for example, for certain inputs, for certain topics, for certain environments and contexts, and so on. Thus forming a center. And of course, it lives in a pressured world where at the same time new information comes from the outside, and we have to compete in our attention, in our awareness, with the new information that comes from the outside, from the physical world. Okay, so it's also a memory structure in itself. Now then, what are these 2 problems that I just listed here? The discussion of free will has very much to do with Libet's finding that given certain tasks, human beings start performing the task before they actually become aware of that, by giving their feedback. One could of course conclude from that if I do something of which I'm not aware, I'm not doing it by free will, but I'm doing it because I'm forced by the mechanics of my inner self. And fair enough, that would be. However, I personally would not agree with such a view, because the lag can simply be explained by this connection of the centers that actually are part of the consciousness with that subpart that is the inner screen. So to speak, it lags a little bit and must naturally so, and still the decision making is our own, because it is based on the longer time discussion, on an earlier priming, earlier in terms of milliseconds maybe just, but also seconds or minutes or whatever unit of time you want to employ. And the becoming aware and the being able to express it must necessarily consume a little bit of time, and therefore just that we recognize something that we are doing later does not mean that it's not based on free will. It just means that the screen as an element of that consciousness, of that personality, is something that cannot be at the same point as the other centers that do the decision making. But the decisive thing is not so much being aware in the moment, but the dialectic evaluation of acting possibilities. When we spoke about media and brain 1, I told you that this group of centers are kind of generators for ideas, and in my model, in my understanding, that there is willpower that acts as a gate, for example by inhibition, and lets only through those ideas that are considered opportune or sane or whatever you want to call it. Then this generation of idea would be the dialectic evaluation, and our willpower would actually be the free will. And since willpower decides in the process of the generation constantly, it must, after the decision link back to the screen. And that necessarily would create a lag. So I personally do not believe that Libet's argumentation leads us to the absence of free will. Rather, it is a model based on the findings of the time that is certainly interesting and important. But I think the physical reality in the neural explanation must be more complex, must rather be a structure as the one that I just laid out, and then the problem as it is stated in that particular work simply vanishes. It's then not there and not relevant anymore. Okay, the thing with the heart problem is, and why is the inner screen interesting for the heart problem, is that the physical world and the perceived world are really separated. Whereas the physical world is based on forces and on materials, the inner world is based on electrons. And that's about it. The hard problem is, how can we perceive the feelings that we have so naturally, given the fact that the brain is locked in? Well, I don't have an answer for that, but I would conclude that, okay, if the brain is locked up, it makes it feelings. That is, if I feel pain from a needle that penetrates the tip of my finger, then this pain is nothing physical, but it is something psychophysical, something inner, that the pain in the physical world actually does not exist. So I would actually turn the argumentation around and wouldn't say that we don't have a heart problem, but the feeling is something internal, just internal. It's not external, outside of you, it is part of your personality. And if we perceive it from that side, it is just like the problem with the free will. It simply becomes irrelevant, because Functioning is part of the brain, certainly, and feeling is also an inside thing. Feeling is not the replication of what happens in the outside world. No, it is actually a way of emotion, of how we describe what is going outside or go on outside in an implicit fashion, just as we had in that lecture block when we spoke about emotion, thus providing the ground, the first stage of learning of how actually we can store that information about the environment and potentially in the future by reflection make it useful as explicit knowledge. So the conclusion from that is that feeling versus functioning is not a contrast. It's not a conflict situation. But both of them are function of the inner brain and not of the outside world. Therefore there is no hard problem because you don't have to replicate the outside. In the outside world, it simply doesn't exist. The needle doesn't hurt, nor does the fingertip hurt. There are people who are suffering from illnesses who don't feel pain, and they of course are facing the problem of easily hurting themselves and not recognizing it, and that makes immediately clear what the evolutionary advantage is of actually having these feelings. But it's an inside thing, not an outside thing. That is how I would approach the problem. Okay, so these are a few aspects that we have. Two more things that I would like to mention here are the first one is, how is artificial consciousness perceivable in others? Matter of fact, we don't know because we are locked into our system. There is the potential of testing. You all know probably the Turing test. The Turing test is simply that a machine is then intelligent if we can decouple the observer, if we can decouple the human tester from the machine or the human, ask it questions and get answers that are indistinguishable. If that happens, of course, then apparently we have simulated human eye. The whole problem suffers from different shortcomings that have been widely discussed over the last 70 years. One being that it is open what questions are asked. Asking good questions that really challenge our intellect and our consciousness is a non-trivial task because definition of concepts is non-trivial, bringing them in sequence over time is non-trivial, and so on. Secondly, it is not clear who the person actually is that performs the test. That also will influence the outcome of the test, and so on. So the practical application of the Turing test is not trivial and maybe even infeasible. However, it's still an important milestone in the thought process towards understanding what the brain and consciousness and all these things are, what their nature is, and therefore it was an important stone. The question really is if it is actually possible to recognize consciousness from the outside. It's probably much easier from the inside. Already as Descartes said, cogito ergo sum. That means that I think and therefore I am. But how do I see that the other one thinks? Only by the actions, and from the actions, if they are sufficiently sophisticated, I can conclude that there is actually consciousness in that other being. That, however, requires observation, long time, and also a keen eye in order to recognize something not as repetitive or just random, but actually as wanted, desired, goal-driven, and motivated by a sane proceeding, which is something for which you actually would have to finish a whole master study in psychology and or sociology. So it's actually a non-trivial task. So we can never be fully sure, I think, whether consciousness exists outside of your own brain. And that, of course, makes the studying of these things not easier. So, last point that I would like to mention very briefly is what is our motivation actually to do something. So we had the testing, then we had the question whether we can see that from the outside. Hard to say. And the last thing is, where do we actually get our motivation here for goal setting? Why do we perform all that understanding? Why do we have to be in the world? Well, apparently, evolution picked those of us who want to survive. Those who don't take the necessary measures for surviving, are not willing to invest into that, and probably will not survive. Evolution should actually guarantee that. And I believe that our desire to survive actually makes us observe the environment, and thus starts this entire process of gathering information, enhancing the information, understanding, and getting forward. So the driving force deep inside all the artificial consciousness is one building block of understanding the world and directing the process, for example, of getting explicit information from emotions, is probably the evolutionary drive to survive. Having said that, thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoy your seminar tasks. If you are unsure of what you should do, please go to the e-learning course. If you have any questions, there is a link there for where you can post your questions. I'll try to answer them as quickly as possible. Should you have troubles understanding, consult the literature. And in the last case, if you have any personal problems that hinder you from doing your task, you of course please send me an email. But if possible, make an entry in the forum, because more people will read it and it might start an interesting discussion that delivers fruitful results for all of us. So I wish you much fun. Please, after you've seen all the lecture videos, choose your topic, register it in the forum. Now the course is actually started, and I'm looking forward to reading your seminar papers mid-May and seeing your presentations in June, hopefully again then after the Corona crisis back in person, because that also matters for our consciousness to have the people available. I've seen it now with recording all those videos. I couldn't see your faces. I don't know if you're nodding. I don't know if you're bored, and that makes it very, very hard for me. I'm essentially blind, and it's not nice to be blind in lecturing. So I hope it still makes sense, and wish you much fun. All the best.